Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to the beginning of the spring 2015 semester. The break has been so long, I think I've forgotten how to explain the sutta. Usually I begin by mentioning the name of the sutta, the number and name of the sutta. Okay, so we are doing this time, it will be sutta number 125 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Dantabhūmi Sutta, which Bhikkhu Nyanamoli translated the grade of the tamed. So the word bhumi originally means ground. So I would actually, if I were to revise this, I would change it maybe the stage of the tamed. Okay, so the sutta begins on an occasion when the Buddha is living in Rajagaha, and at this time there was a novice whose name is Achiravatta. I don't think he's mentioned any place else in the sutta, in the Nikaya, so he doesn't play a very prominent role. So it said that he was living in a forest hut, and then the prince named Jayasena, according to the commentary, he was the son of King Bimbisara, who was the king of the state of Magadha. He was taking a walk for exercise, and then he came across the novice Achiravatta. They exchanged courteous greetings. And then the prince presents a certain question, or he makes a certain statement to the novice. He says, I have heard that a monk who abides here diligent, ardent, and resolute can achieve unification of mind. The Pali expression that's used here is chittas ekagata. Chitta, of course, means the mind, and ekaga means one-pointed. So ekagata is one-pointedness of mind. So unification of mind is a little bit vague, since if you're not completely distracted, you could say, I have a unified mind. But chittas ekagata means the ability to bring the mind together so that it's focused consistently on one point. Okay, so then the novice confirms this and says, that is so, that is so. A monk who abides here diligent, ardent, and resolute can achieve unification of mind. Okay, then the prince asks the novice to please teach me the Dhamma as you have heard it and learned it. Mastered it is too strong. This is a novice. Maybe he's not a master of the Dhamma, but he's learned some Dhamma. Okay, so then first the novice refuses. He says, I won't teach you the Dhamma as I have heard it and learned it. For if I were to teach you the Dhamma as I heard it and learned it, I think the Pali would actually be translated, you might not understand you might not understand the meaning of my words. This is what is called the optative, which could be translated in either way. Now I would prefer you might not, because it's not so certain. You would not means surely you won't understand. But you might not means maybe you won't understand. And that would be wearying and troublesome for me. Now, what strikes me as interesting is that the Pali here uses exactly the same words. If you remember, or you're familiar with this scene that takes place, it's recorded in Sutta number 26. After the Buddha achieves enlightenment, and he's still sitting in the area of the Bodhi tree, and then he's reflecting, should I or should I not teach the Dhamma to the world? And then he considers that this is actually in Sutta number 26. It's in paragraph 19 on page 260. He thinks that this Dhamma, especially dependent origination and Nibbana, is very hard to understand. Then he thinks, if I were to teach the Dhamma, others would not or might not understand me. And then he says, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. So it's exactly the same words that the novice is using, the same words that the Buddha used when he initially decided that it would be too much trouble to try to teach the Dhamma. Okay, but then the prince is insistent, so he says, let Master Agivesana, that's the family name of the novice, let him teach me the Dhamma as he has heard it and learned it. Perhaps I might understand the meaning of his words. So now the novice agrees to this request, but he's going to attach a kind of little proviso to it. It's a little bit like, what do they call this in Congress when they're passing a bill and then they attach a rider to the bill. So he says, okay, Prince, I'll teach you the Dhamma as I have heard it and learned it. If you understand the meaning of my words, that is good. But if you don't understand the meaning, then just let's leave it at that and don't question me about it further. So apparently the novice is not so confident about his own knowledge of the Dhamma, so he's afraid that if he's going to get cross-questioned, he might be put in an embarrassing situation. Okay, so the prince agrees to this condition, and then the novice starts to teach. So he gives some teaching, the content isn't recorded here, but when he finishes speaking, then the prince breaks out in a very rude, aggressive, provocative way. So he says, it's impossible, Master Agivesana. It cannot happen, it's inconceivable that if a monk dwells here diligent, ardent, and resolute, he can achieve cittase kagata. He could achieve one-pointedness of mind. Okay, and then having made that outburst, then he just gets up from his seat and leaves. He doesn't even give the novice a chance to respond to that. Okay, then sometime later, the novice goes to the Buddha, pays homage to him, and then he reports this whole conversation to the Buddha. Then the Buddha, he makes a very important statement here. He says, how is it possible that Prince Jayasena, living in the midst of sensual pleasures, enjoying sensual pleasures, being devoured by thoughts of sensual pleasures, being burnt up by the fever of sensual pleasures, being dedicated to the search for sensual pleasures, how is it possible that he could know, see, or realize that which must be known through renunciation, seen through renunciation, attained through renunciation, and realized through renunciation? That is impossible. Okay, so the Buddha is setting up here a kind of dichotomy or a contrast between, maybe you call it two ways of life, two types of mental orientation. There might we use the word nekama, which is translated as renunciation, but there might actually be two derivations of this word nekama, sort of two different meanings which sort of get mingled together in Pali. You see, actually I think it's sorry. Okay, so one derivation of nekama is from a verb, nikamati, which means literally stepping away or stepping out. And it's sometimes used in just ordinary discourse, like if one is leaving the city or the house, it's nikamati. But it's also used in Buddhist literature to signify the act of leaving the household life in order to become an ascetic or a monastic person. And so from the verb nikamati, one gets the noun nekama. So nikamati is going out, departing, and so what we render renunciation is literally departure from the worldly life or household life. But there's another possible derivation, which is as the negation of kama. Kama means sensual desire or sensual pleasure, and then the prefix nir is a negation, meaning without or devoid of. So nikama would be devoid of sensuality, departing from sensuality. And from this, the word nekama can be derived. So nekama is renunciation, both in the sense of stepping away or departing from the worldly life, And it's also nekama, renunciation, in the sense of nikama, leaving behind sensual pleasures. And so what is meant by one-pointedness of mind or unification of mind is the same thing that we also call in the Buddhist literature, we call it samadhi, concentration, collection of the mind. And particularly it would be referring to the more eminent forms of samadhi, which are the jhanas, the meditative absorptions. So it's a state in which the mind is completely unified on its object without any discursive mental activity, wandering thoughts, upsurges of emotion, distracting emotions, but the mind is just steadily, undistractedly focused, absorbed in its object. So sometimes we translate this as meditative absorption. And so now Prince Jayasena, apparently as a prince, he's living a life of luxury and enjoyment in the palace. And yet somehow, based on his own experience, he thinks he's the great authority. So he can say, it's impossible, it's inconceivable that anyone can experience and enjoy perfect unification of the mind. Okay, but the Buddha points out that in order to enjoy this unification of the mind, it's important to fulfill the preliminary conditions, which it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to renounce in the sense of becoming a monk, because there are also lay people who experience the jhanas, but one has to have the disposition, the inclination, the bent of the mind to depart from sensuality. And under sensuality, we could see sensuality or sensual enjoyment as being just the kind of first member of the set of the 5 hindrances. So in order to experience one-pointedness of mind, one has to overcome the 5 hindrances of sensual desire, ill will, dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and remorse, and doubt. And so if one is living in the midst of sensuality, enjoying sense pleasures, then the mind is going to be prone not only to sensual desire, but when one is frustrated in one's sensual longings, then there'll arise anger and ill will, and the mind will get buffeted also between restlessness and dullness. And so the Buddha is saying that in order to attain unification of mind, one has to be disposed to renunciation. And if one isn't even disposed towards renunciation, one shouldn't make pronouncements about what is possible, what is impossible. Okay, then to illustrate this, the Buddha uses 2 very impressive similes. Okay, first he takes an example of we have a pair of animals. They could be elephants, horses, or oxen. And these animals are said to be well-tamed and well-disciplined. And then we have 2 other animals that are to be tamed. And these are said to be untamed and undisciplined. The way it's presented in the Pali, I have to say, it's not all that clear, so I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. Okay, so let's say, instead of putting the question this way, I'm going to put it, would the two elephants, horses, or oxen that were well tamed and well disciplined be able to perform certain feats, certain tasks that the master might direct them to perform? For example, with an elephant, well, when I first came to Sri Lanka, my first week in Sri Lanka, I was staying at a monastery or temple in Colombo, and the monk told me that he would take me to the zoo. There was a zoo outside Colombo, the Dehavala Zoo, to see the dancing elephants. And so we went to the zoo, and then sure enough, at the appointed time, could be 3, 4 in the afternoon, the elephants come out dressed up in, fancy, do they call these caparisons? And then they go walking around in a circle. Then when the mahout hits the drum, then the elephants start dancing. Okay, so this is something that a tamed elephant can perform. And we have horses that can do many different tricks. You could tell a horse to rise up, it'll rise up, and kick in the back, and the horse can do various kinds of work, carry loads and so on. But if you just have wild elephants, wild horses, they can't perform those tricks, those feats, those tasks. Okay, so the Buddha uses this as a comparison. So the elephants, horses, or oxen that are well-disciplined, well-trained, that's like the person who is disposed to renunciation, who has taken up the life of renunciation. That person can do feats and tasks with the mind that the person who is undisciplined, untrained with the mind won't be able to do. And that person with the untrained, undisciplined mind, that is like the untrained elephants, horses, or oxen. But I like the second simile better. This is the one on paragraph 9. Okay, so the sutta says, suppose there were a high mountain near a village or town, and then 2 friends would leave the village or town, and they would go to the mountain. Okay, when they reach the mountain, then one friend stays below at the foot of the mountain. So from what follows, it seems it has to be more like a hill than a mountain, as we'll see. Okay, so one friend stays at the foot of the mountain, while the other climbs to the top. Okay, then the friend at the bottom of the mountain says to the one at the top, he says, "What do you see from the top of the mountain?" And the one on the top says, "Oh, standing on top of the mountain, I can look into the distance and I see beautiful parks, beautiful groves, lovely meadows, and lovely ponds." And you see why I say it's a hill, because if it's really a mountain, unless you have a powerful amplifier, you're not going to be able to address somebody who's on the top of the mountain. Okay, so the one on top says he sees all of these lovely sights. Then the one on the bottom says, it's impossible, it cannot happen that standing on the mountain, you might see lovely parks, lovely meadows, lovely groves, lovely ponds. Okay, so the one on the bottom of the mountain thinks he's the great authority about what lies on the other side of the mountain. But he hasn't climbed the mountain, so how can he make any authoritative statements about what is on the other side of the mountain? But now the friend on the top comes down to the foot of the mountain, he takes his friend by the arm and pulls him up to the top of the mountain. And then, giving him a few moments to catch his breath, he says, "Well, now you're on the top of the mountain too. What do you see on the other side?" And then the other friend now has to admit, "Well, standing here I see lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, lovely ponds." And then the first friend now says, "Well, didn't you just say it's impossible? It cannot happen that from the top of the mountain we might see these lovely sights?" And then the first friend, or the friend from the bottom of the mountain, now has to admit that I couldn't see them because I was obstructed by this high mountain. Okay, so now the Buddha applies the simile to this Prince Jayasena, and he says, "So Prince Jayasena is obstructed, hindered, blocked, and enveloped by a still greater mass, that is, the mass of ignorance." And so he was obstructed by ignorance, and I would also say he was obstructed by his involvement with sensual pleasures. And so since he's living immersed in sensual pleasures, how could he know, see, or realize that which has to be known and attained through renunciation, through the departure from sensual desires? Okay, then the Buddha says, if these two similes had occurred to you when you were speaking to Jayasena, he would have spontaneously acquired confidence in you. He would have gained trust in you, been pleased with you, and then he would have expressed his trust and confidence to you. But then the novice says that, how could these two similes have occurred to me, since they've just occurred to the Blessed One himself spontaneously, that's right on the spot, and they've never been heard before? Okay, now at this point, the Buddha sort of takes off and goes into a detailed exposition of the training of a disciple, delineating the stages of training by which he is led to the point where he's able to gain that unification of mind. And there's a Chinese parallel to the sutta. This is in the Chinese Majjhima Agama. It's sutta number 198. And there are some interesting differences between the two versions. And I actually, Venerable Analayo, in his studies on the Majjhima Agama, he has a comparison between the two versions. And he makes what I would call a convincing case that in certain respects, the version preserved in Chinese translation is probably more reliable than the version preserved in Pali. For certain reasons, I'll bring those reasons up as we go along. Okay, here the Buddha is sketching the stages of training of the disciple. But first he's going to do this by comparison with the training of an elephant. And this would be something that would be quite familiar to an audience in northern India. The Buddha would have experienced this himself when he was living as a layman in the palace. Since it was common in India in Sri Lanka to have elephants brought out from the forest, from the jungle. Then they have to be trained in a systematic way and tamed so that they could perform many different tasks. Not only dancing in a zoo, but they do a lot of labor. You know, in ancient times they didn't have trucks and bulldozers. So to get this heavy work done, like transporting logs over long distances, you don't have a big truck to put them on, but you get the elephant, the tamed elephant. The lumberjack will cut the trees, but to transport the trunks a distance to construct a building, the elephant is brought along, and the elephant uses his trunk. He wraps his trunk around the trunk of the tree, and then carries the trunk of the tree a long distance, and then drops it where the master wants it to be deposited. And elephants in the wild, I don't have first-hand experience with wild elephants, but they're said to be, they can become very dangerous animals. They can be very, very wild and destructive. So one has to know how to catch an elephant, how to tame it, how to train it step by step. And how the Buddha, if he was really a prince, would have known all of these steps, it's quite amazing, but he must have picked them up either by hearsay or by personal observation. Okay, so it starts when a king addresses the elephant woodman to go into the jungle and to catch an elephant. So he says, when you see a forest elephant, bind him by the neck to the king's elephant. So this is the strategy. We have an elephant that's already tamed, and that elephant is brought into the forest, and we're going to use that elephant as a decoy to attract the wild elephant and use him as a kind of anchor in order to hold down and to begin the training of the wild elephant. Okay, so the elephant woodman mounts the king's elephant, enters the forest, and when he sees a wild elephant, he binds him by the neck to the king's elephant. And then the king's elephant, guided by the woodsman, leads the wild elephant out from the jungle into the open. Okay, so in this way it is said, a forest elephant comes out into the open, for the forest elephant clings to or longs for the woods. So this is like the first step in the training, is to bring the wild elephant out from the forest into the open. But while he's brought out into the open, he's still longing to return to the forest and struggling to get back into the forest. Okay, so now the king addresses the elephant trainer, and he says, "Come, good man, tame the forest elephant, subdue his forest habits, his memories of the forest, his thoughts of the forest, subdue his distress, fatigue, and his fever, it's not quite a fever, his excitement about leaving the forest, and get him to take delight in the town and inculcate in him habits congenial to human beings. Teach him how to get along well with human beings." Okay, so the elephant trainer says, "Yes, sir." Okay, then he plants a large post in the earth, and he ties the forest elephant to it by the neck, in order to subdue his forest habits and to train him so that he's able to get along well with human beings. Okay, so this, we could say, is the second stage of the training, that is subduing the forest habits and making him get along with other human beings. And then this is to be done by binding him to a post which is deposited or planted deep in the earth. And that post has to be planted very deeply, because a powerful elephant, by using the full might of his body, can tug and push and pull up the post from the earth. And we have to bear in mind that these are going to be analogies for the stages in the training of a person, particularly the monk, to be able to gain unification of mind. Okay, then the elephant tamer addresses the elephant with pleasant words. He speaks to him in ways that are gentle, pleasing to the ear, lovable, that go to the heart, courteous, desired by many, agreeable to many. Good morning, elephant. How are you today? Are you enjoying the scenery here in the town? Maybe we all love you. We want you to become a member of our community. We're going to feed you well. Okay, so when the elephant starts to quiet down and become subdued, to become tame, then the elephant trainer will reward him with fodder and water. And when the elephant, probably in the early days when he's pulled out from the forest, the elephant, because he's so upset, he won't even eat or drink. Maybe he thinks it's better to die than to live on in captivity like this, just a prisoner. But once he starts to get used to the elephant trainer and to hear these gentle, loving words, his heart softens and he shows his willingness to eat the fodder and drink the water. And so then everybody knows now the elephant is going to live. He'll submit to the training. Okay, so now the elephant tamer is starting to train the elephant. So he gives him various simple tasks. Take this up, put this down, go forward, go back, get up, sit down, until he masters all of these simple tasks. Then, when the elephant shows that he's been trained up to this point, then the elephant tamer trains him in the task called imperturbability, or immobility, not moving, not budging, even in the midst of attack. Apparently, this elephant is being trained not for ordinary tasks, but to become a war elephant, because the kings would also use elephants as vehicles in war. So he now trains him in the task called imperturbability. And here the Pali says, he ties a giant plank to his trunk. I think if I remember, the Chinese version says that the elephant trainer actually ties down his 4 limbs, the 4 legs. Okay, then a man with a lance sits on his neck. Men with lances surround him on all sides, and the elephant tamer stands in front of him, holding a long lance pole. Okay, when the elephant is being trained in the task of imperturbability, he does not move his forelegs or his hind legs. He does not move his forequarters or his hindquarters. He does not move his head, ears, tusks, tail, or trunk. And now the king's elephant is able to endure blows from spears, blows from swords, blows from arrows, blows from other beings, and the thundering of drums, kettle drums, trumpets, and tom-toms. That would be the scene that he would experience in the midst of the battlefield. And so now it's said that the elephant, being rid of all faults and defects, purged of flaws, is worthy of the king, in the service of the king, and he is considered one of the factors, one of the excellent factors of kingship. Okay, so now this long passage on the training of the elephant, this is all being sort of set up as a parallel or an analogy against which the Buddha is going to depict the stages in the training of the monk. Okay, so here the Buddha begins, this is the standard sequence on what is called the progressive or graduated training. So it begins when the Buddha appears in the world, he teaches the Dhamma. Some young man of good family hears the Dhamma, gains faith in the teaching, shaves off his hair and beard, and puts on the ochre robes and goes forth into homelessness. So this is all being implicitly described, this is all being implicitly set up as the parallel or application to the example of how the elephant in the forest is caught and pulled out from the forest into the open. So here we have either the Buddha or a disciple of the Buddha or someone in that lineage coming from the Buddha teaches the Dhamma, and then someone, so that person, whether the Buddha or the disciple teaching the Dhamma, this is like the trained elephant, and he's going out into the world and teaching the Dhamma. That's like the elephant woodsman going into the wood in order to catch the wild elephant. And the person living in the midst of the world, that is like who's going to be caught and trained, that is like the wild elephant. So then getting that person to shave off the hair and the beard, put on the yellow robes and enter the homeless life, that is like having the elephant come out from the forest into the open. So then it says, the text says, it is in this way that a noble disciple comes out into the open, for gods and human beings cling to the 5 objects of sensual pleasure.